All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. You are here for increasing performance test coverage without compromising on agility. And if you guys weren't aware, just really quickly to give some housekeeping items real quick. Zoom has a Q&A function, which if at any in a chat function. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to shoot those into there. We'll try and answer them as fast as we can. There is going to be time at the end for questions as well. So if you want to keep it to the end, feel free, but we'd love it to be as interactive as possible. So feel free to shoot through any questions that you may have. So just to give a little bit of background on SmartBear, we were founded in 2009. We now have 11 global offices around the world. We're up to 6.5 million users with 22,000 customers. We also have 5 free tools, and now we're up to almost 525 employees. So pretty exciting. Just some context for people that may not be familiar with SmartBear. And then in terms of our products, we have a bunch of tools that help software development teams all over the world move faster and deliver quality software a lot easier. And so our product portfolio scans across the entire software development lifecycle. So from design to creating to testing and then finally to monitoring. And our partners help facilitate deployment as well. So today we'll be talking more along the test line, obviously, and specifically talking about a little bit about LoadNinja, but toward the end. So my name is Saoirse Hinksman. I'm the marketing manager here at SmartBear, and I have Keshav with me if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm Keshav. I'm the product manager for LoadNinja and the performance testing as a whole in SmartBear software.
Alrighty. And so to give you guys a little bit of background on the agenda today, what we're going to go over is really quickly shifting to agility, how we got there. We'll give you some background on understanding performance test coverage, how you can determine and execute on that test coverage, how LoadNinja can help, and then, like I said before, we'll run through any questions you may have.
All right. With that said, Saoirse, let's just actually start jumping right in.
Yeah, let's go for it.
So, let's start by understanding, this movement we're seeing over the past 10 or so odd years where software teams as a whole have started to move faster and are developing and also testing much faster. Right. So in order to understand this paradigm shift, it's important to understand where we're coming from, the historical context of software development. Traditionally, software development and delivery has been a linear and siloed process, and we all know this. Business developers, QA, ops people, analysts all work in isolation to deliver products at relatively a snail's pace. And this traditional method uses a linear approach where each of these stages of software development are broken down and they have to be completed in sequential order. This means there's a separate phase that's in a planning phase, right? And once that's done, only then will people start developing this. Once the development's done, then they hand it over to a testing team, and then finally there's an operations team and so on. Right? And bugs are discovered late in the process after development is fully finished all of their features and then handed off to the QA team. Right? This is where like the performance center of excellence comes in, or functional test quality center of excellence, where there's like a central assembly line of testing teams who are just waiting for different projects and different developers to hand them off features to start testing. Right? After all of these pieces are assembled and put into the QA phase, at this point, it becomes much more expensive and time consuming in order to identify these bugs, because again, they have their own assembly line in order to get all these bugs, get all these potential QA projects, prioritize and work on them one after the next. So while this is happening, many times developers and the people before them will sit in isolation and wait for the next project to come by. And same with the operations team. So this is typically what we've seen in the past. What we're seeing, however, is a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift is primarily driven by consumers of the web applications and applications as a whole, which software teams are building. We're in 2019, we're seeing that, more than ever before, we as consumers are exposed to digital products, digital applications. In fact, MarketWatch recently conducted a survey, and they realized that we as consumers spend over 11 hours per day interacting with different forms of digital media, that is interacting in front of us, interacting and working in front of a screen. right? This means we as consumers are spoiled for features, right? We're exposed to so many different applications every day that as consumers, right now, we just want applications that work, that they have the best features, and they also deliver constantly on new enhancements. And anytime there's like any sort of quality compromise, they want that fix to be delivered as soon as possible. So we as consumers are spoiled for quality, for features. The next aspect is that, while we also want to make sure that the applications that we invest our time in, that we spend our hard-earned money in, also work and work as intended, and also are stable, and they respond really quickly and well. So we're spoiled for quality as well. And this is really important because I say these things because in today's day and age, the switching cost to move from one application to the next is pretty low compared to what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And from a trends perspective, the switching cost is traditionally expected to be going lower and lower as we move further down the line in terms of digital saturation. So software teams have done their best in order to accommodate the growing demands of consumers, right? So this is the reason why software development has become very, very agile. And this is why engineering teams are constantly building new features and enhancements and also releasing new bug fixes every single time. And also in order to accommodate for the growing demands of consumers and growing expectations from a quality perspective of consumers, testing has shifted left. Testing is no longer a siloed process that waits for development to finish the different features and enhancements that they've delivered and then have pass it on to the testing team. Testing is becoming integrated into the development cycle, and testers are coming further left and are moving further left into the software development and delivery cycle. So in testing, you can look at it broadly as functional testing and performance testing. Functional testing is, of course, making sure that different functionalities of the application works as intended. And performance testing is ensuring that the application performs well, is responding at the right speed, and is meeting the service level agreements that consumers have started to expect of applications. And functional testing tools, processes, and people as a whole have evolved to accommodate agility, DevOps. They've essentially taken their existing tools and processes and incorporate them into an agile and DevOps focused workflow, meaning that they can move faster, they can deliver faster as well. However, performance testing to this day is still seen as a monolithic and centralized function. This is primarily because, one, there's outdated processes, of course, but these outdated processes are essentially a byproduct of the demands that tools that exist in the market expect from their users. Because again, tools traditionally, the performance testing tool technology and the performance testing scripting and testing process from these different tool vendors have not evolved to meet the growing needs of software development teams. And performance testing is incredibly important, right? So in today's day and age, it's as I mentioned before, there's never been a time where performance testing has not been this important. So, for example, we have statistics that show that even a 1 second delay in page response can result in 7% reduction in conversions. 40% of people abandon a website that takes more than 3 seconds to load. E-commerce websites are typically bear the brunt of bad performance, and so we've seen if e-commerce site is making $100,000 a day, and even a 1 second delay could result in over $200 to $2 million of loss in sales, right? So all of these statistics just go to show you that poor performance can actually result in business losses for the company, for the application, and for the team as a whole. So, when we talk about software development and when we talk about software delivery, we advocate for essentially testing and development to move together in parallel. So this means that in the planning phase, as you as PMs or product managers or dev managers scoping out different features and enhancements, it's also important to incorporate the quality teams, the QA teams, to also start thinking about, based on these different features and enhancements that we're going to be working on this specific sprint or this specific cycle, what are the different scenarios that we'll need to plan through from a functional test perspective and, of course, from a performance test perspective. From here, while the design of these different engineering tasks are being scoped out, it's also important to start thinking about the designing of the test cases themselves. Then, of course, it moves to the development phase where you actually have your engineers roll up their sleeves and actually start working on those different features and enhancements that you have, right? In this case, your QA team should start thinking about the various scenarios and potentially starts crafting them together as well. Finally, of course, there's the deployment phase. And if everything goes well, when you run the functional performance tests in the pre-production environments, everything goes well, you push it to, you release this. Right, so agile testing aligns with iterative development methodology in this case. Agile testing eliminates a dedicated testing cycle and is a continuous process rather than sequential. And so, the core pillars of agile testing, primarily the takeaways of the slide is, testing is not necessarily a phase; it's a continuous process. And as you're seeing on the slide, it evolves and goes further along the line as you go into different life cycle stages of software development. It allows you to deliver value more frequently at a sustainable pace. And value doesn't just necessarily mean new features; it also means good quality. And finally, there's continuous feedback, not just from QA to development, but also because QA is now the voice of the consumer, it's kind of giving, they are also providing direct feedback from the consumer's perspective as well of the application. So when it comes to actually automating your test cycles as well, you can essentially, if you have the right tooling infrastructure in place and of course the right methodologies in place, you can essentially shorten your agile delivery cycles and essentially automate a lot of these processes, right? So for example, you could potentially every time you have a deployment, automatically run functional and performance tests instead of manually doing this. And many times in today's day and age, functional testing tools have released like easy to access REST APIs that allow you to programmatically drive your tests, and performance testing tools are of course getting there. And of course, if once you've passed all of these different checks, you can potentially go forward and automatically release this. And if it fails, it gets sent back to development. It's prioritized by the PM or PO or dev manager, and then again push forward into the life cycle. So this is typically how we're seeing agile testing teams incorporate QA into their agile processes. And of course, as I mentioned before, functional testing tools have evolved very well, but performance testing tools, unfortunately, there's still some lack in the market, which is primarily what's causing people who are passionate about performance and product teams who want to deliver on good performance and they're getting held back because the paradigm in performance is still not evolved to meet the growing needs of software development tools.
All right, so now that we kind of understand how we got here, it makes a little bit more sense to talk about why test coverage is something that kind of causes a lot of team stress. It puts a lot of pressure on teams to understand and make sure that when you're releasing quality software and that you've checked all the boxes, you made sure, okay, this is 100% ready to go into production. I can deploy confidently and know that when I deploy, it's going to be great. Everything's going to work well. In theory. And then, so to give a little bit of background, test coverage really refers to how well the number of tests executed cover the functionality of an application. So essentially what that means is, what are we testing, how much are we testing, and what bases are covered with this testing. So typically when we're talking about test coverage, there are a couple different types of test coverage that we can go through. If you want to talk about the difference between, there are two kind of like lenses that you can take, right? Product coverage, which is really kind of understanding what are the functional areas of the product that you're testing, right? So Keshav, if you want to run through an example, we can talk them through that too.
Yeah, of course. Like for example, when we're thinking of test coverage, as Sarsha mentioned, there's like a couple of lenses that you can look at and understand the different types. Right, so there's the product coverage, which is essentially looking at the functional areas of the product that you've tested. So typically, let's take, for example, an e-commerce application. Right, Sarsha, when I talk about e-commerce, what do you think of?
I'll probably think of just a shopping site. So typical, like if you're going in, you want to buy clothes, or maybe Amazon. Amazon's a good example everybody uses. You go in, you'll log in, figure out what you want to get, add it to your cart, look at the price, adjust any like billings, things like that, and then I'll try and check out.
That's exactly what it is, which is
Yep.
essentially looking at the core functional areas of the application and essentially incorporating all of the major functionalities that go into those scenarios, and thinking of those and looking at coverage from that specific lens, from a core functional and jobs to be done perspective, which is what is the end user's final objective and what do they do in order to get to that specific objective. Then, of course, there's the other lens, which is looking at it from a risk coverage perspective, right? In this case, we kind of adopt not necessarily a very qualitative, functional, outcome-driven approach, but more from a business perspective. What is essentially looking at it, the risks associated with not testing a certain component or feature or a specific set of transactions, right? So in this case, for example, in an e-commerce application, it's not every day that you would be handling 10,000 users, but maybe during specific days, like say Black Friday, you might have your e-commerce application have over 10,000 users. In those cases, when there's like as we showed in a previous slide, if there is a delay in a certain transaction, how many potential users do we tend to lose, and what is the associated loss for those specific number of people who drop off the website? And so there's a certain risk associated with that, right? So it's essentially looking at looking at all of your different transactions and then saying, if a certain set of transactions do not work, what happens from a business perspective? What is the loss I can estimate, and what is the probability of occurrence of this, which is typically the classical definition of risk, which is probability of occurrence versus loss due to that specific occurrence. And again, we will show you in another slide as to how you can potentially calculate this as well.
So one thing that we just wanted to make a little bit more clear too, because this comes up in conversation a lot, is the difference between test coverage and code coverage. Both of these measures are really useful when you're trying to understand the quality of your application, but test coverage really refers to how well the number of tests that you execute cover a functionality of an application. So you can think of this with more of a black box testing mentality. So you don't necessarily have to know more of the back end of the application. You just have to know, how does this application work, and how is a user going to interact with this application? What are the functionalities that I need to know if they're business critical, that they're going to work in production? Versus code coverage, which refers to how many lines of code are you covering in your tests. This is more of a white box testing mentality, where you have to be really familiar with the code in your application to know exactly what's going on, and make sure that when you write those tests, you're covering each line or a specific set of lines that you know are critical to your business.
Yep.
All right. So both of them are pretty useful, as we had mentioned before, but really assessing what is the most relevant for your company and your team. What are the goals that you're trying to evaluate? That can help address some of the challenges that come up when you're trying to understand how, because at the end of the day, you can't test everything as much as you would love to. And so it's really about finding a balance.
Yep. So for example, like as Sirsha mentioned, right, it's about finding that right balance, right? Performance testing is typically looked at it as a very daunting task. This is the reason why even to this day, performance testing, you have a centralized performance center of excellence, and you have these engineers who've gone through like 10 years of training and certifications in order to become like performance testing experts and incorporate that into their performance center of excellence. And traditionally, many agile teams will essentially send their performance testing projects to them, and they will prioritize and get to them as soon as they can. And the reason this has worked primarily is because, again, performance testing has always been seen as a very hard thing to do, right? So this is where we have the biggest challenge, which is executing on the coverage. Once you've identified what the right coverage is and how you have to look at the coverage, and also, of course, plan your test cases, creating those different scenarios, which involves scripting, which involves playing those different scripts back and making sure that those transactions have been successfully captured, and of course then taking those scripts and stringing them together in different various load testing scenarios is an extremely hard, laborious, and time-consuming process. Right? Traditionally, creating performance test scripts takes way longer than functional scripts. This is primarily, again, and we'll detail this in future slides, but this is primarily because when you're creating a performance test scripts, you essentially record the end user transactions from the protocol level. This means you're capturing all of the different traffic between the server or your browser between the client, which is your browser, and then the server. Right, so all of these transactions could be a huge, voluminous amount of data which you capture. And then once you've captured this, in order to verify that these actions have been successfully taken into account in the script, you have to do something called playback. And to play back, if there's any sort of dynamic components like cookies, session IDs, or so on in the transaction between the server and the client, or the traffic between the server and the client, you will have to do some programming and correlation. This takes anywhere between several hours to a few days, even for the most basic of transactions. Then, of course, there's the other challenge, which is you have to essentially, the results you get back as well will be in terms of requests and responses between the server and the client. This is not necessarily the way engineers look at it when they're building applications. So there's a handoff process where the performance tester has to essentially look at all of this data, which they're getting back, convert that into something that is meaningful for the developer team to debug, and essentially translate all of these findings in a more consumable way for them. And again, this is a time-consuming process. And finally, of course, requests and responses between server and client don't correlate with end user experience. So out of the box. So you have to, as a performance tester, spend an additional amount of time doing this. So if, as you know, agile and DevOps in today's day and age is all about moving fast. Those three processes I've outlined essentially are the foundations of basic performance testing. And all of them take a lot of time and effort for functional teams, for testing, for performance teams, for developers to get started and become successful with it, which is, again, primarily why teams are so hesitant of incorporating performance testing into their agile and DevOps focused workflow. So these are the challenges, and we will be detailing how you can actually overcome them in these subsequent slides. So let's look at the first challenge, which is determining coverage. How can you actually find the right amount? How can you get to that just right section on that picture you're seeing over there? And this is where we've, after talking to a lot of clients and after looking at the market and also like finding some great case studies, we've determined that there's a philosophy you can use, an agile philosophy called the Pareto's principle, right? Statistics typically show that users never use more than 45% of an app's feature. 19% of them are hardly in use, and 16% of them are occasionally used, and only 20% are used frequently or always, right? So based on these statistics, we can sum up that even if we focus on 20% of the core functionality of the app and the core transactions, we can really get to the real benefits and guarantee its further development, and also make sure that if those 20% work, most of the people will be satisfied. Right, so it's essentially looking at it from a very practical lens, how you can use the Pareto's principle and essentially take this principle, incorporate that into your planning phase of your test cases, and again, become successful and ensure that your end consumers are not compromised because of poor quality. Right, so the Pareto's principle serves to improve the overall software process through the software development lifecycle. This finding has heavily influenced the agile management model, and of course, as a byproduct, the testing management model as well. So let's look at a practical example of how to actually go through this, right? So in the first step, we will be essentially looking at, in the first step, of course, we will be looking at mapping the typical set of expected user transactions. So look at your applications and just, again, look through all of the different transactions that you potentially expect your end consumers to see. If there's like, if your application has been in production for a while, and if there are features that people have been using, look at the analytics tool. You have Google Analytics, you have Mixpanel, so many different analytics tools that can inform you about different usage, right? So map the set of typical expected use cases for your application and the associated transactions that go into it. From here, assess the percentage of usage among the active users, right? So once you determine all of your users, understand for existing features, what is the percentage of usage among the active users of your application per month, per week, depending on whatever time unit that you have based on the delivery of these new features. For existing features, you can do that directly with the analytics tool, as I mentioned. For new features, well, the best thing you can do is make a guesstimate. Right, so guesstimate, is the new feature that you're adding, this new enhancement, part of a core workflow that you typically see a lot of users interacting with, right? Or is it in an outlier situation where it's a nice to have on an outlying set of transactions that typically users don't necessarily interact with. So think through all of those different use cases and make a guesstimate of what the potential usage of these features could be. Finally, if you want to, this is an optional case, and if you want to really be practical method and of course analytical, you can also assess the risk when users have bad experience in these specific transactions or in these new features and enhancements that you're adding. As I mentioned before, the risk is the formula is probability of occurrence times the loss due to occurrence. Right, so I'll give you a practical example of this.
And I kind of want to just pause really quickly because I know that this sounds like a lot of data that you may not have on hand, but something that I find really useful is just reaching out to other teams. So for example, one thing that you may not think of, I think a lot of people don't think about this from a software perspective, but if you reach out to your marketing team, 90% of this information is stuff that they will have. Any demand gen team should have, or web team will have access to Google Analytics. They'll have the highest traffic paths. They'll have the most business critical sort of user interactions with any of your applications. Because at the end of the day, all of your goals sort of roll up into the same higher business goal. And so if you're struggling to understand, okay, what is the value of this, or where do my users go? What are the critical things that they're looking at? Feel free to reach out to those people as well. And I know that a lot of ops teams will have this information as well. So if they use a real user monitoring tool, they'll have that. Even if they use something like lightweight, like Google has Lighthouse functionality, which gives you that type of data as well. Ask them for that. I know that people are more than happy to share data like that, especially when it doesn't necessarily put anybody at risk, and it'll help at the end, especially ops people, because at the end of the day, it'll help them ensure that what you're deploying into production is going to be of quality and not going to cause them problems down the line.
Mm-hmm. Great point, Sarsha. Great point. This is where, again, Agile is all about collaboration. So involve many people in and get that right data. So for typically in a use case over here, for example, identify the transactions. As over here in the table you're seeing, there's the sign up transaction, there's a credit card transaction, maybe there's the add to favorites transaction in, say, an e-commerce application. Understand the different steps the user has to take in order to go through those different motions. Right. So for signing up in this case, you have those different steps. For updating a credit card, you have those steps. And of course, to add it to, say, for example, a wish list or a favorites list, you have those steps. Then, of course, understand what is the percentage usage. In this example over here, we're seeing that 72% of people, active users, typically sign up in this application. So in this e-commerce application, we don't see many people actually shopping and adding to and checking out that app, their pets, or their store inventory items without signing up. Updating credit card is about 9, and of course there's 17% of them add to favorites. Over here you can actually stop, right? If it's an existing feature, you can just stop over here and you can say, what is my threshold value? I want to make sure that all the features I'm going to test moving forward are used by at least 10 to 20% people, right? So in that case, you can do, you can start testing the sign up flow. You can test the add to favorites flow, maybe the update credit card flow. You might say, because it's only 9%, I can get away with it. But if you want to add an additional lens to this, which is, again, the associated loss that comes with not going through those different motions successfully by the end user, think of like what the business loss could be. So I've added some, of course, like generic numbers over there. So for example, loss due to faulty experience in the sign-up flow, let's say it's $500. With the update credit card, it could be $180. And with the add to favorites, maybe we're seeing a drop off of 20 users who typically spend about $20. So the risks associated with not spending them based on the classical definition are, as you can see on the screen. And if we as a company are risk averse, as a testing company, we can say, if my threshold is $100, I want to make sure that this is $100 is my threshold amount. In that case, the update credit card becomes much more useful and important to test because, again, many people there's actually a business loss associated with not going through those motions successfully. right? So this is another lens that you can use, not from a product or from a functional perspective, but more from a business and loss risk averseness perspective. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how you can actually apply the Pareto's principle. Now moving to the next slide. So this is essentially all the things I've detailed in this slide is about how you can overcome the challenges from a planning perspective, right? Understanding what are the different coverages, what is the coverage, and of course understanding what are the different scenarios I need to incorporate in different cycles for maximizing my coverage. Now, of course, the next part is essentially understanding how to execute on this coverage. Once you've done the basic analysis, and again, that analysis can be done successfully if you're incorporating testing early on in the planning phase as well. So it gives you enough time to go through those motions. Once you've done the planning, how can the performance testing team, based on all of those different drawbacks I had mentioned, where it takes so long to actually create a script, several hours to a few days at least, even for the basic transactional scripts, takes so much time to essentially translate the results you're getting into something that's more developer friendly, and finally correlating the results, which are again shown in terms of requests and responses between the server and the browser, to something that is much more actionable, that is much more closer to the end user experience, right? So how do you correlate that? All of this takes a lot of time. So in an agile, as we mentioned, as we've continuously hit on, it's all about moving fast while still not compromising on quality. So from a performance testing perspective, as we've mentioned before, one second, I think there's an issue with my screen. Let me
I can switch sharing. If we want to, actually, I've been waiting for a pause. Can we just get a show of hands if anybody is currently struggling with this? I know this is something that we talk about a lot, but I think it's kind of interesting to just get a quick view on hey, listen, this organization is struggling too. I feel like it's something that people don't really want to talk about or bring up because it's kind of sucky to say, yeah, we're having trouble with this and we're really looking for a solution, but it is something that everybody shares. So if you want to participate, feel free to use the raise hand button. Don't worry, I'm not going to send you anything after. I just want to do it for terms of discussion. But yeah, I see people raising their hand. Okay, there you go. So a lot of people that are here are raising their hand as well. So it's just nice to know sometimes that even though you feel like, I know it's easy to get caught up in that whole my team is behind or whatever. Everybody's trying to overcome this, right? And everybody has a different version of this in their organization or within their team. And so trying to get a better understanding of hey, this is something that as an industry, as a market, we have to work through. And then being proactive about making sure that not only that your team is working to do what it can to share, move faster, help each other, but also making sure that the tools that you have or that you're looking for can support you in that goal as well.
Of course. Great points, Sushil. Great points. And as you're seeing on the screen over here, right? So all those three different challenges, there are solutions out there. And as an industry, as Sarsha mentioned, we should work together in order to overcome these specific challenges and move forward as a performance testing unit. So for example, if it's taking too long to create scripts, adopt tools that essentially allow you to not necessarily look at it from a server client interaction, but from the end user's perspective. Look at it from a real browser perspective. Right, so create scripts from the client side that require no dynamic correlation, programming, or playing back, and no scripting to capture client-side AJAX calls. Right, all of this will save you a lot of time. If you want to, for example, use tools that, if it's taking too long to translate the results between tester to developer, use tools that provide developer-friendly metrics out of the box. Right, and of course. It's also important to make sure that you can have the right testing framework, and also making sure that you essentially incorporate real browsers as well for load testing, so that you always get the most accurate and reliable results that exist in the market. So this is something all those different challenges we showed you in the previous slides, and of course talking about the process change as a whole when it comes to incorporating performance testing into Agile. Those are some of the questions we asked ourselves as well before we essentially embarked on this journey to try to revolutionize and reinvigorate the performance testing space as a whole. The outcome of those questions that we asked ourselves was LoadNinja. LoadNinja is essentially SmartBear's flagship load testing platform that essentially allows developers, testers, performance testers, QA engineers, and consultants to essentially load test web applications using real browsers at scale. And the cool thing about using real browsers at scale is it actually adds a bunch of different functionalities and enhancements that solve the challenges that I've mentioned in those previous slides. For example, because we are now capturing transactions in the script from the client side, you can essentially instantly record, but more importantly, instantly play back all of those different transactions without doing any coding or correlation whatsoever. If there's any sort of client side, AJAX calls, like say, for example, you click a button and there's a pop-up that shows up, you as a developer or you as a performance tester don't have to do scripting in order to capture that. Right, which is traditionally what typically other tools, most performance testing tools will expect you to do, because again, they're capturing all the interactions between the server and the client. Because we're using real browsers at scale, so real browsers to actually generate load. So you can be rest assured that this is the most accurate representation of load on your web applications. Because we're using real browsers, another byproduct is that the data you're going to get back is also pure, real browser-based performance data, right? So this is the exact data this is the exact experience which your end users see, and the data you get back as well is reflective of that. And finally, this data is actionable out of the box because of the fact that we're using real browsers. You essentially get nav timings information that gives you a full breakdown of the different components of the request time, of the end user experience that people see. And we'll show that in the demo as well. You can essentially use this platform to visualize all of these different virtual users who are coming in and interacting with the application. And of course, debug them from the client side to essentially understand exactly what the specific issue is. And all of those things I'll show this as well in our demo over here. So, I want to take I want to take a pause over here, and I want to essentially talk about using all of those things that we just learned about in a simple demo. Right, so in this case, let's say, for example, in a demo scenario, because we want to keep this as close to real world as possible. Let's take, for example, that we're demoing it, we're load testing an e-commerce web application. We've realized that in our agile workflow, we've added a few features, and it's up to us right now to incorporate a little performance testing before the feature goes live. Primarily, the features that we're talking about is essentially the ability to search and add to cart. Maybe it's a new functionality and we've enhanced that flow a little bit. So, we're expecting a guesstimate of about 60% of people will potentially be using this capability, right? So essentially, it's an enhanced workflow to add items to your cart. And of course, I've gone through the motions of also guesstimating what the loss could be if there's a faulty experience. So typically, we see just from looking at the e-commerce space as a whole, loss due to a faulty experience of not having a core search feature is about $800. And so this is, again, like something we can look at the market for, and we also estimated the associated risk from not testing this. So this gives us a full holistic view of saying, these are the different transactions we need to be testing for, because our risk averseness maybe has a threshold of about $200. Just, again, examples. The scenarios we'll be testing are, 20 VU test, simple test. The duration of the test will be about 5 minutes, and we're going to be parameterizing the search transactions in order to make this more data drivable and incorporating external data to increase our test coverage.
We have a question that just came in. Someone asked if they're understanding correctly, LoadNinja provides something like true client of LoadRunner. So the idea is the same. It is not the same, though.
Yes, because with True Client, it's similar, but it's not. But the challenge with True Client is that typically there's a threshold to how many real browsers you can use, right? So typically it's about, I'm guessing it's in the magnitude about 200 to 300, and beyond that you'll have to again go with the load generating agent, right? So with LoadNinja, it's essentially using real browser at scale. So be it 30 users or 30,000 virtual users, we will be generating real browsers at scale for doing these load tests. So you capture all these transactions on the browser side and just spin it up in a real browser and then scale that across whatever number you want. So with that said, let's actually go ahead and launch our application. Let me actually switch sharing. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Try one more time.
Let me try it again.
There we go.
Awesome. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. So right now I am in the LoadNinja application. We're seeing this on a browser because LoadNinja is a SaaS application that's delivered on the cloud. I've just logged into LoadNinja, and the application that you're seeing right now is the pet store app. The view you're seeing right now is the projects view, right? In LoadNinja, projects are essentially think of LoadNinja projects as folders that you can essentially organize the different test assets that you have. This could include scripts. This could include, for example, I have certain scripts over here. This could include different scenarios, which are configurations of your load test, and finally, of course, a few runs as well as needed. So in this case, let me actually go ahead and create a new simple project. Right? In this case, I'm going to say webinar, call this test coverage. I'm going to do a basic description, Once I do that, I'm taken into the views of the project. And if you notice, of course, we don't have any sort of scripts or scenarios or test runs and so on. It's a brand new project. So now let's actually go ahead and record a few transactions. Before we do, I actually want to show you the actual application we'll be testing. So let me open it up right over here. As I'm opening it up.
And we can talk about too, like the ways that we would evaluate how you are going to test this application are based off of some of the things we had mentioned before. So like, let's say that we are the pet store, right? We know that we really need to make sure that people can search and add the pets that they want to their cart. Those are the key business critical things that this application serves for this business. So those are like the paths that we need to know 100% are going to be okay, even if we have a sale, even if we post a post or some promotion on Instagram or something, and now everybody's running to get a new puppy or fish or whatever. You need to know that that's going to work.
Yep, exactly. And so this is a simple e-commerce application that we're going to be testing. And again, it's very basic. You can just search for items and add them to your cart and, of course, check out. So I can essentially click the record button in the projects view, and it essentially gives me a prompt to enter the URL of the application that I want to test. I put in the URL. I can also specify the form field that I want to be creating the script for. And this is especially useful in today's day and age when you have responsive web applications that show different buttons and behave differently for different screen sizes. So in this case, I'm just going to be creating this for the desktop view. I'm going to click Start Recording. As soon as I click Start Recording, I'm going to be taken into LoadNinja's InstaPlay Recorder. On the right is the Ren edition of the browser of the app, and you can see your application just like how your end user would see. On the left over here are the controls for the recorder to control the recording, and all of the different actions that I perform on this application will be recorded over here. So let's actually go ahead and do a few simple transactions, right? So in this case, let me actually go ahead and log in. So I'm going to be logging in right now. And now let's just click log out over here, right? So it's simple login transaction. I went into the home page, I clicked on login, added my credentials, and I'm logging out. So now from here on, typically what you'd have to do is you have to play this back. Right, and this is where, like traditionally in load testing tools, you'll have to like do the dynamic correlation, the programming, understand what are the different dynamic components. In this case, there's a cookie that goes in, right? If you're that's based on my credentials, which you'll have to again correlate across subsequent transactions in order to get it ready for playback. In LoadNinja's case, all of this is abstracted because again we're capturing everything from the client side. So I'll show you an example. I'll show you how do we play this back. So I'm going to just set the think time to minimum because I was talking while we were recording and I don't want to have those times reflected in the playback. So now once I click playback, what is that now? We're searching, we're putting in those different items, clicking sign in, and there you go. We essentially went from the first step all the way till the final step without doing any programming, correlation, or any other scripting whatsoever. If there's any sort of client-side pop-up models or any sort of client-side like drop-downs, changes, any of those kinds of things, all of that will be abstracted because, again, there's no server-client relationship necessarily. It's all taken care of from the browser's end. So let me actually save the script. And I'm going to call this the login test. And I'm going to click save. The next set of transactions that I want to be looking at is the ability to search for pet items, right? So this is another set of transactions that we had uncovered in our planning phase, and we looked at the fact that there could be a lot of risks associated with not necessarily going through the testing of this. So let me actually click record again. This time I'm going to put in the application. And now let me actually log in. And this time, let me actually search for the pet item itself. So I'm going to click poodle over here. Let me add this to the cart. Right, let me actually click checkout over here. Right, and in this case, let me make sure that we have put in, say, 1170, put in 105. I'm going to put Cambridge, MA, 02129. And from here, I'm going to put in, say, and I'm going to click submit, and I'm going to click stop. So essentially right over here, what we did was we essentially went through step 1 all the way till the final step, and which is logging in, adding items to the, searching for a specific pet item, adding them to the cart, and then of course, checking them out. So now let's go ahead and actually click playback over here. So I'm again going to change this to minimum. Logging in. Notice again that we're doing, I'm not interacting with the application. This is all during the playback, and we're capturing all of that.
So in terms of test coverage, as we kind of defined it before, so in terms of like covering all the bases from a user perspective, you can imagine how easy it would be to do something like this. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of time or effort, really, once you've decided, like, okay, I know that this test is a priority for me because it's a business critical functionality, or it has like this amount of risk or this amount of dollars tied to it. You can get right in and make sure that you're creating the right test and making sure that it's playing back properly. And then in a little bit, we'll show you how to get it up and running.
Mm-hmm. And so right over here, what I just did was I actually recorded all of these transactions, and I've gone through an entire set of transactions and played it back all in a matter of minutes. Now, of course, as Sarisha mentioned, we need to think about test coverage. And many a times when you're actually load testing, it's not common that, say in this case, all of the different users will be searching for the same pet item. It's not common, of course, that everyone will be having the same address, right? So you can essentially data drive all of those different inputs and essentially expand the test coverage as well by parameterizing the right inputs. So in this case, let's say I already have a CSV file set up that has a list of all the pet items, right? So I have that called the demo data bank CSV. I'm going to then parse this. And then I'm essentially going to map that specific demo data bank to that search animals field. And now I'm going to click map. And then now when I click playback, we're essentially now going to go through the motions. But remember where we had searched for the poodle item? We won't be searching for poodle anymore. We'll be searching for another item that is taken from our data bank, from the CSV file that we have. So in this case, again, it's taking. So now it's searching for an iguana, because again, this was the data row that was present in the external CSV file. Now, the cool thing over here is that once you, of course, attach the script to an external data bank, you can also define how you want the script to pick up the data. Right now, it's picking it up randomly, right? Meaning, if you have like 100 rows, when you have multiple VUs in the specific load test, they will be picking up different data items, in a random chaotic order. You can essentially ensure that that all the VUs pick up the data items sequentially, right? So this means in the first iteration, VU number 1 picks up row number 1. Second iteration, VU number 1 picks up row number 2. So sequentially picking it up. Or you can also ensure that at any given instance of the load test, all the VUs will always have unique data items being picked up. So this way, this is especially useful for applications where you want to ensure that all the users who are logging into the application are unique, and you can data drive the username and password, right? So again, all of this is done simply from the UI, no programming, scripting needed whatsoever. So I've essentially recorded these transactions, I played it back, I've attached a data bank, and I've also specified how I want the data pickup to be. Now let's also do another thing. Let's add a validation. Now, validation is just a best practice, because what you want typically is, like, you want to make sure that the end user sees the right page at the right time. So what we usually recommend when you're scripting in LoadNinja, when you're recording a script, is to also, when you have certain key pages, add a validation to that page to make sure that they're on the right page, right? So if that validation passes, you can be rest assured that the end user has seen what you want to see. You can also define validations that intentionally fail. And with that, you can, we've seen certain types of customers do this, where they can ensure that the end user doesn't see anything that they don't want them to see, right? So let's take, for example, I want to ensure that my homepage contains the word admin, right? So I'm going to put that page contains, and I'm going to set that to the homepage. I can also add another validation to say on my final step, and say I'm going to call this a fail validation. And I'm going to intentionally writing something here, which is puppy. I know that the last step doesn't contain the word puppy, but I'm going to do that anyways, because then I know that it'll fail, and I'll show you how LoadNinja handles errors as well. Right? So let me add that to the shopping cart over here in this step. And of course, I'm going to add that. If you want to do more complex validations, you can as well. But we have a JavaScript terminal, which you can then use to create more complex, creative validations if needed. So with that said, let me actually now save the script, and I'm going to call this search. Once I'm satisfied with this, I can now start to create a scenario. Think of a scenario as a load testing configuration, right? This is where you can essentially add VUs. In this case, let me say, 20 VUs. So I'm going to add 20 VUs. I'm going to add specific scripts, right? In this case, I'm going to add search and the login. Let me remove this, and let me say it's 50-50%. So in this case, there's like 10% of the people will be going, 10 VUs will be going to search, and 10 will be going to login. We can, of course, modify this percentage to be reflective more of like the end user expectations, right? So if you remember the scenario which I had, we expect that about 80% to go to the login scenario, and about 60 to go into sign up, right? So, about 40 to go into sign up. So you can do those creative distributions as well. I'm going to set the VU number to be 5 minutes. I'm going to set the playback to be recorded. Let's set it to minimum, which is essentially the fastest way you can go from step 1 to step 2. And finally, you can also define how you want the LoadNinja to handle errors. This is where you can define, if say, for example, there's any sort of error that LoadNinja encounters during the load test, what we can do is we can hold the connection with that browser live, and essentially allow you to log into that browser using a JavaScript terminal and start debugging that issue from the client side. And so this, again, is unprecedented in the market, and this is a byproduct of using real browsers, right? So this is essentially now telling me that I can it's telling me that I've set the scenario to be using unique, and I don't necessarily have 20 I have more views than I have rows. So that's why I can do it unique. So let me just set that to the same number of rows, which is about 16, and now click run. And now, as soon as I click run, we are now going to be connecting to our server based on the number of VUs, allocating the right number of load generating instances, and then spinning up real browsers for every single corresponding virtual user. And all of this is done out of the box. You as an end user do not have to worry about any of this, right? So we manage the servers, we will do all the allocation and spin it up ephemerally, and of course shut it down, again, all depending on how many VUs you have. And typically the wait time is anywhere between 2 to 3 minutes.
So what if you need a dedicated IP?
Yeah, so typically what we see is, there are consumers who have internal applications that run behind their firewall. And so in those cases, we can give you a dedicated static IP that you can whitelist in your network with your network team. And so that way you can allow LoadNinja to generate load for internal applications behind the firewall. Right, so now LoadNinja is going to be allocating the servers, and even though it says 2 minutes, will probably take 30 more seconds before the load test actually fully starts, and you can start seeing the results populate.
So this would be a really good time if you guys wanted to put in any questions that you have, concerns, if you have questions about things that we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about, feel free to shoot it through and we'll answer it as fast as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've gotten a couple good ones, so keep them coming.
So this is, again, the power which I want to emphasize over here is that I've essentially been able to record a few transactions, play them back, all dynamic transactions, by the way. They have cookies, they have session IDs. All of this was done in a matter of minutes. And now I'm essentially running a load test. And of course, in this case, I've done it with 16 virtual users. But again, 16 views or 16,000 views. The process is exactly the same. You as a performance tester do not have to do any correlation, programming, scripting whatsoever. It's instantly coming in, recording, playing this back, and then get to the load test. And this is, again, our biggest use case we've seen with LoadNinja is the Agile and DevOps team who want to be successful, with moving fast, ensuring high quality, but also not compromising any scenarios that they know will be impactful for end users. So now you're seeing the LoadNinja results populate, and we have different tabs, of course. We're seeing, for example, the end user response time. So this is typically the way we define this is typically how the end user would experience that application or those different pages, right? So this is how it's populating from 0 seconds, which is when the test starts, all the way here. Anytime I hover over the application, over these different transactions, I can see the breakdown as well of the different components of the response time. And this, again, is because we use real browsers and we get the navigational timings or the network times that takes place. So we can see typically that it's taken about 2 seconds to load the DOM. It's taken about 2.4 seconds for the first byte to come in. The DNS time is 3 seconds, and so on. All of this overall make up the total end user experience, right? This, of course, you're seeing it from a script level. You can, of course, drill down to a specific step level as well. So in this case, I can say the most important page for me or pages for me are, say the sign-in page, right? So I can just drill down to that specific page, and I can see, again, that's the end user response times for that specific page. And the same applies for nav timings, error counts, and success rates as well. You notice that there's like a few error counts that you've just encountered. The reason for those errors are because we've added a few validations that were meant to fail. Remember, we were searching for the word puppy on step number 5. Well, that it was not able to encounter it wasn't able to find the word puppy, and so it's failing.
So we have a couple questions that came in. So I'll just run through them as they came in. So is this tool for web only? Will this work for SAP, S4, HANA using Fiori Web UI?
Yeah. As long as the application you're trying to test is accessible on a Chrome browser. So just open up a Chrome browser and try to hit your application. If you can hit the application, if you can interact with the application, it should work on LoadNinja.
And then do you need to buy a certain price plan in order to get the static IP?
Yes, there's a certain pricing that's associated with the static IP, and we'll be happy to put you in touch with the right account manager as well if needed.
And how many tests can we execute concurrently?
So there's different tiers for different tests, right? So it's all available on loadninja.com pricing, and I'll show you that towards the end of the load test run as well. So if you go to loadninja.com/pricing, you can find that. So right now, I just want to show you 2 quick things. The first is the view inspector, which essentially allows you to inspect the virtual users live as the test is happening. So notice here that I can essentially, because we're using real browsers, we essentially pick up 4 random users, and you can see them going through the transaction live based on, of course, the scripts, the actions that you have in your script, and also how many views you've configured. And so anytime there's certain issues, you can see that happening in real time, and this gives you some context and information on how to recreate that as well. So in this case, you'll notice that it's stopped over here. It's static, because you're searching for the word puppy and it's not, and so the LoadNinja just held those browsers for you to see. You can also, of course, interact live with the browser, with the debugger. So anytime there's any sort of validation error, you can potentially connect to that browser live and start interacting with the browser using a JavaScript terminal, and again, to start debugging this from the client side as well. Right? So all of this, again, is available with LoadNinja out of the box. You can see the network trace associated with this anytime there's an error, right? So in this case, you see the network traces associated, and you also see how long it's taken for specific web elements to come in and interact. And here we're seeing that there's a 404 associated with the specific web element, meaning there's a web element that's not been found. That's also been captured over here. So that really brings us to the closing of the webinar over here, right? So let me actually pause sharing. I know I spoke a lot, and I know there might be a few more questions. So feel free to like start talking about them while I pull up the right QA slide.
All right. So I'm actually going to pose a question for you guys, if that's okay. This is just a final poll. I know that we ran through a couple of things really quickly. So this is really helpful in terms of like, I know there are a lot of people who have asked me separately about this. So if you guys feel like you'd like us to reach out, either me or Keshav or any of the account managers that we have here to help out with this, feel free to let us know. If you have any other questions, feel free to shoot them in here. I know that we're right up on time, but we'll be here for a couple more minutes. And if you want to send us a question later, we've included our email and our Twitter handle. Feel free to DM us or send us an email. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. We try and respond pretty quickly. So.
All right. Well, with that said, Susha, I think it was a great webinar. Thank you so much for all the questions, people. It was phenomenal to present to you.